Hello, my name is Tiffany Wilson-Worsley, and I am the Director of Employee Learning and Engagement at the Center for Economic Inclusion. Today, I will provide an overview of how throughout history, systemic racism has created our current racial wealth gap. This knowledge is essential for us to build a racially inclusive and equitable regional economy, one that works for everyone. Racial inequity today is sustained by overtly racist talk or action, and those certainly exist and should continue to alarm us. But today, I invite you to unpack the racial inequities that have come to sustained by their own momentum, because they are baked into our belief systems, into the places, policies, and practices that shape our daily lives. Today, we introduce the 500-year wealth gap. This timeline was created by Living Cities to create a common understanding of the historical economic exclusion practices designed to exclude the Black community. While this timeline focuses on the history of slavery and reparations for African Americans, a parallel timeline could exist to highlight institutionalized and systemic oppression toward Native Americans in attempts for reparation. So as you hear and follow the history, the key dates and events, I want you to remember that all this happened and continues to happen on stolen land. Now let's look at a timeline. I'll highlight some key dates here. 1619, the first ship carrying highly skilled, enslaved Africans. They then land here at the English colony of Virginia. Then in 1860, we see a surge of wealth created. Cotton grown and picked by these enslaved African workers was known to be the nation's most valuable export. According to Matthew Desmond of the 1619 Project, slavery was undeniably a font of phenomenal wealth. Another key date, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. At this point, formerly enslaved Africans were now freed. However, there was no intentional way forward to build wealth. There was no capital given. Thus, wealth building was out of reach. By 1870s, a decade after the 13th Amendment, Black wealth nationally was near zero. 99.95% of the nation's wealth was owned by white Americans, and 0.05% of the nation's wealth owned by Black Americans. 1900, whites were allowed to take advantages of several wealth-creating and social mobility opportunities, such as free land, access to capital, and home ownership subsidies, from which people of color were legally excluded. Again, in the 1900s, we saw that 46% of white Americans owned a home versus 22% of Black Americans. Properties across the country had racial covenants prohibiting the sales to Black people. By 1944, the GI Bill was passed, offering college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance to veterans. However, the implementation of such reward made the benefits inaccessible for the majority of Black veterans. No greater instrument of widening an already huge gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. By 1983, the median Black wealth was $13,000, and 105,000 was the median wealth for white Americans. We see here by 1998, the wealth gap widens. Today, the wealth gap continues to widen. I highlighted a few historical events that created and widened the wealth gap. Now I want you to think about the wealth gap and how it shows up today. As we think about different data points and different opportunities by which we see this, I want you to think about how this shows up in your organizations, how it shows up within your leadership. When you think about home ownership rates, when you think about asset income, when you're looking at an organization and their leadership team, when we look at wage and promotions, who's more likely to get promoted? These are still places where we still see contributions to widening and maintaining the intentionally created wealth gap that exists today. I want to leave you with this. Change requires conscious interruption of the status quo. That to embrace racial equity in our organizations, we have to acknowledge the history and the impact of racism on today's wealth gap. We also must hold an honest narrative of what truly happened, how we got here. And then we also must then examine the current systems that are holding the systemic problem in place. Only then can we continue to create systems that institutionalize racial equity, to build a racially inclusive and equitable regional economy, one that works for everyone, where race does not determine one's outcome. Thank you.